We'd like to say good afternoon to everyone and welcome to the Master of Educational Technology at UBC's speaker series. This is the anti-racism in the ed technosphere at UBC. And I am pleased to be offering our fourth presentation in this series. My name is Dr. Carrie Ewert, and I'm a lecturer for the Master of Educational Technology program, what we call MET here at UBC, and one of the designers and co-coordinators for the Anti-Racism in the Ed Technosphere speaker series, along with our director of the MET program and colleague, Dr. Samia Khan, whom you will meet right now. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Samia Khan, who is going to be giving the land acknowledgement.
I'm Dr. Samia Khan, Director of the MET Program, Associate Professor and Co-Coordinator with Dr. Carrie Ewert of this seminar series. For our listeners, one of the ways we begin meetings in Canada is to acknowledge the Indigenous people on whose taken land we benefit from. This is part of a broader national truth and reconciliation effort in Canada and at UBC. I am speaking today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation. My house, the Master of Educational Technology offices, our servers, and our institutions are located on this territory. Our work today is made possible because of the colonial dispossession and forced removal of Indigenous peoples. A more expansive statement on our commitment to Canada's 94 calls to action can be found on our MET website as the statement on commemorating Canada's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. These calls to action invite us to commit to change. UBC has just released its 54 recommendations from its Anti-Racism and Inclusive Excellence report this week. And MET has launched our third talk today in the series on anti-racism.
The purpose of the speaker series is to acknowledge the commitment that every individual has to inclusivity and to addressing systemic racism with a focus on anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, and anti-people of color racism. This series seeks to identify the responsibilities that educators and leaders have to facilitating and supporting anti-racist approaches and strategies for truth, readdress, and reconciliation within their practice to enhance and transform learning environments and learning cultures. With a specific directive being on digital technologies, presenters of this series will discuss racism and tools to support reconciliation in the changing dynamic of the digital age. Now, as a result at MET, we are committed to following up with each presentation of the speaker series with a call to action. And this is a challenge to everybody who is here. So we invite all of you as attendees to make one change this month and to share it with us in the next steps. And we will be discussing this as the presentation goes on at the end, as a means for reconciliation, allyship, and community building, education, and through the use of educational technologies. So this call to action provides you the opportunities as attendees of the speaker series to build on the anti-racist content from the presentation and steps to make change. For example, you might integrate what you've heard today by thinking and talking about a lesson plan or an idea with a colleague or a neighbor, for instance, in bringing awareness to the issues of redressing for students, colleagues, and friends. So we will provide you more details at the end of the presentation. And I do want to mention that we will be using a tool called Slido that will allow you to ask questions throughout the entire presentation. So you'll be able to post your questions. Vanessa's just posting that link right now in the chat area. And that way you can ask those questions and our presenter will be able to answer them at the end of the session.
It is our great pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Dr. Patricia Makokis. Dr. Patricia Makokis resides on the Saddle Lake Cree Nation with her husband, Eugene. The Makokis family stays close to the community, recognizing that their job is service, and they all remain focused on sharing community-based needs in ways that demonstrate their deep love and commitment to service to and for the people. Patricia has been a frontline teacher, a vice principal, a principal, and for the last 25 years or so, an educator at the post-secondary level. She has taught in both mainstream, Western, and tribal institutions of higher learning. Currently, she is teaching online in the Master of Educational Leadership program at the University of Alberta. Dr. Makokis studied at the University of Alberta, San Diego State University, and attained her Doctorate of Education degree from the University of San Diego. Her doctoral research looked at why First Nation students dropped out of provincial high schools. That academic work took her on the path of learning and coming face to face with understanding historic trauma and the long-term intergenerational impacts of trauma. We are very much looking forward to your presentation, Dr. Makokis, on the lifelong journey of coming to terms with historical trauma and the role of education and technologies in this journey. Welcome, Dr. Makokis.
I want to start by acknowledging the Creator. I want to acknowledge the Creator, our ancestors, my ancestors, your ancestors, all of the organizers. I want to acknowledge Dr. Margot Greenwood, who is a friend of mine who asked me to sit in and take her place today. And I want to acknowledge my appreciation for all the tech folks who are doing their master's degree, because tech isn't an area that it's not my forte, let's just say that. And so I always am very, very appreciative. And for that reason, I've asked Dr. Ewert to move my slides so I could just focus on trying to have a conversation on this iron horse. And the reason that I call the laptop the iron horse is for people, Indigenous people on the plains, we made our living on the land with the buffalo. The buffalo was one of our main sources of food, of how we lived. And so many years ago, I published a paper with colleagues of mine from the University of San Diego. And I referred to the laptop as the iron horse because it's the new way. And who would ever known that COVID would happen and we would find ourselves learning this way? So it's kind of ironic. But interestingly for me as well, and some of you, as I speak, probably are going to think this woman is really crazy. But before I start work, I smudge my office. I use our land-based smudges. I smudge my iron horse because I have a relationship with this machine, and this machine and I engage in doing very, very important work. So some say, of course, it's inanimate. I would say it's animate, and that can be argued. Next slide. All right, so I have been introduced and I've chosen this picture to put in because of my little grandson, Ateo. Ateo is 7. He's got long hair. He's had some experiences in school that weren't pleasant. And so as I come to talk about historic trauma, he's part of the reason that we have this trike. Him and I ride. I bought it when I turned 65. And Ateo was just a little boy that was wheeling down White Avenue in Edmonton. And later he got his little scooter and he'd park his scooter with the bikers. And this work for me is very, very connected to helping sever trauma relationships, trauma ties. And so this is one of the reasons why Ateo and I ride. And I, as I was preparing for this presentation, I calculated how many years I've been doing this work, and it's actually 43. So I asked myself, can we have a mutual goal? And the mutual goal that I'm going to invite you on this journey with me is that you participate and commit to being a lifelong learner. Because I put this old house, and 43 years ago, I started talking about this because my dissertation, was starting way back at the Blue Quills Residential School. 22 years ago, when I did my defense, this topic of trauma was and continues to be on the radar for me. So speak the truth, even if your voice shakes. And trust me, there have been so many times over my career that I have spoken on this topic and people weren't listening. So I'm asking you to be open to learning from Indigenous people, take a back seat, make space, and let's drive together, because this work, we absolutely are called into this work together. And for me, It needs to be the rest of our lives. So I'm asking you to think about that. And some of you are, are thinking like, wow, she's asking a big commitment. But that's part of our philosophy, is that our elders tell us we are lifelong learners. All right, the next slide, please. So I want you to imagine that we're sitting in a circle, and that we could all have the privilege and benefit of being in this space together, and that I could start this teaching with smudge and prayer and help with that process. Because our elders always say we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should be listening twice as much as we speak. And so this particular teaching, if we were sitting in a circle and we put an object in the center of that circle, we'd all describe what we saw, and everyone would see different points of view from each other. Some would even see opposites because they'd be sitting on the opposite side of the circle. In other words, you don't have to see what I see for you to be right. In fact, everyone in the circle is right based on their own point of view. If we are willing to listen to everyone's point of view, then we can get to a more accurate description of the object in the center. This is one way for us to put our minds together. When we get clarity from each other, we should give thanks and be grateful for that. And it's a very simplistic teaching, but the elder that I used to work with, one of them always told our students, we have to listen and we have to watch. And as we would be sitting in those circles, he focused on the importance of us coming with that good, open mind, open heart. So today, let's think about that as we go through my slides. All right, so this is Blue Quills. This is the old residential school that's 30 kilometers from where I live. And I went to school there. My husband went to school there when it was a residential school. This is his mother in the picture on the right, the lady with the plaid. And she, along with all our elders back in that day, a group of them they had a sit-in. And the sit-in was about, we can do no worse than what has been done. We want to run this school. And so that sit-in happened. Chrétien came. Chrétien was the Minister of Indian Affairs at that time. And he said, how are you ever going to run this? They give you 6 months and you will be out of business. I left Blue Quills when we were celebrating our 40th anniversary of local control. So the point of this being that this blood memory, this history, and this work that we're all many people just waking up to, it's in many people's DNA across this country. And so this is really important. But it's a big secret, all of these years of talking about this and teaching this. And really, at one point, I can tell you, I was reported to the dean of my faculty because we were teaching a course on the history of Native education in Canada. And I was teaching at that tribal institution where I started my undergrad degree in 1974. What happened was we were teaching this history, and one of our white family members, our white students, made a complaint to the dean at the University of Alberta because talking about us being biased because we were teaching our truth about this history that people are only just finding out about. So I always tell my students, we are truth tellers. We are not troublemakers. So in this work of coming to terms with trauma, we also have to talk very openly and respectfully about racism, indoctrination, white privilege, white entitlement. Because why is it that Indigenous knowledge was missing? That I'm asking you to think about who benefited from that. Who benefited from the fact that our worldview, our history, our knowledge was not in the history? Who benefited from that? And I ask you to search your heart and to think about that and sit with your families and ask yourself what it is you know about Indigenous people. Where did you learn that? And how could you possibly look at expanding wherever you came from in that knowledge? This is a hard reflection that I'm asking you to do, and it has to start with you. And from you, then you have to have conversations with your family and your friends and so forth. Because if I look at that iceberg, racism is rampant. And Indigenous people in this country, the first peoples to this country, in this country where we believe the Creator placed us, and our creation stories have us here on Turtle Island. Racism is at the tip of the iceberg, and this trauma that I'm asking you to think about as I speak is all the stuff that we're not talking about. So this is Thomas, and Thomas really could have been a picture of my son. My son looked like Thomas with his long hair, and he would dress like that. But in residential schools, Thomas had to dress the other way. And really, if you Google Justice Murray Sinclair, there's a 2.5-minute clip. And he says to the audience, you Indigenous people were taught that they were savages, they were heathens, that they were uncivilized. But while they were taught that and their parents were taught that, you too were taught that. Your children were taught that. And so we're coming to that place of having to do a soul search about what happened in this country. You know, what were we all taught? And I can tell you over and over, because I teach at the master's level, and I always hear, why didn't I know this? Why didn't I know this? Because it impacts our relationships. So one of the folks that put this all together in policy was Johnny MacDonald, right? And this was a quote from my doctorate degree. Indian children should be taken away from their parents so as to eliminate the barbarian influence and expose the children to the benefits of civilization. The teacher has been sent out as an educational missionary to introduce changes so that we were seen as barbarians. Often in the literature, we were uncivilized, we were heathens, savages, we were not humans. And so if you look at that information for yourself, you will see the Doctrine of Discovery and Terra Nullius. These were, through the church, the way of recognizing that these were not Christian people, they were not human beings because they weren't Christian. And so therefore that was how this was justified. And that Doctrine of Discovery continues today. So this is in our history, and it's something that we have to understand. And the next one is Duncan Campbell Scott. So basically in this quote, what he's saying is we need to continue to do this work. So there's not a single Indian in Canada that hasn't been assimilated, essentially is what he is saying. But really, when you look at this is the most horrific history, secret history that has been kept from everybody because it was genocide. It was genocide, physical genocide, where mass killings, targeted, biological. There's proof of the destruction, sterilization of women, cultural genocide, in terms of all of these things that were done to Indigenous people. And this is not a long time ago, because the last residential school ended in 1996. So when you look at these, over here, about a kilometer from my house, is a Roman Catholic church. That Roman Catholic church would load up farm trucks like that, including my husband's family, and take them from Saddle Lake to Blue Quills, which is 30 kilometers. And all of these things were very intentional. So I want you to look at that W5 documentary on St. Anne's Residential School, because well, you'll see that they had homemade electric chairs. And we're talking about children. We're talking about children that were between the age of 4 and 16. In fact, that elder that I spoke to you about, who talked and taught about us using our hearts in how we come to do this work, he was 4 when he was taken from Saddle Lake, put on a train and taken to St. Albert, where he stayed from the age of 4 till he was 16. And he was one of those children that dug graves. He dug graves. And as you come to understand this history, when you walk through that door, my little grandson's name is Ateopan Asini, Spirit Rock. And he was given that name along with his long hair that he wears as part of his spiritual identity as this little Cree boy. He was given that name. And so if he had walked in that front door, he might have become number 50. And they took his name away, and he knows the importance of his long hair for his spiritual connectedness in our teachings, and his hair would be cut. Now, you strip people, you dehumanize people when you do that. And that's what happened when they walked through those doors. So George, from 4 years old, he was taken from Saddle Lake and dug the graves. He dug the graves. He would talk to our students when we were team teaching. He was a little boy. So when you went through the door, the big boys went one way, the little boys went one way, same for the girls. Siblings were separated, couldn't talk to each other. So George was a little boy when he was digging graves. And what happened to him was he got stuck. The big boys got out, but George couldn't get out. And so George stayed in that grave until he was missed at supper time. And then, so you have to ask yourself, what would have happened to George? So this is Peter Bryce, and Peter Bryce was hired by the federal government to go and do an inspection of the residential schools. And when he went to do those inspections, these were some of the things that he found. 25% of the children of the 1,537 that where he went, 25% were dead, 69% were dead at one school, and there was overcrowdedness, inadequate heat, poor nutrition. And his report, actually, if I remember correctly, he was fired because they did not want that report. And that's written in the book by Milloy here, entitled The National Crime. So when I came into this work, I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. I met her. She too had done her work on residential schools, on those schools in the States. And I met her at a conference where she was talking about her research. And this is how she defined historic trauma: as a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across the generations, including the lifespan, which emanates from massive group trauma. And when you think about what's happened in this country, we are 1996, the last residential school closed. That's not long ago. So you have generations of families that are impacted by this trauma. Dr. Marie Batiste talks about cognitive imperialism. And when you look at her work, what she's saying is when Indigenous knowledge is omitted or ignored in schools, and a Eurocentric foundation is advanced to the exclusion of others' knowledges and languages, these are conditions that define an experience of cognitive imperialism. So based on what I've told you, just who benefits from this? Who benefits from dispossessing us? When you did the land acknowledgement, you talked about the dispossession of folks on the land. you know, so that in that land acknowledgement in and of itself is something that needs to be soul searched in terms of who benefited when Indigenous knowledge wasn't taught. You know, when the Truth and Reconciliation Apology happened in 2008 by Harper, and then 2015, the actual calls to action and the report were given, who benefited all of those years from keeping Indigenous knowledge and giving it its rightful place within the belly of the beast? And I talk about the academy, the Western Academy, as the belly of the beast, because for this reason, it's how many of our people struggle in post-secondary institutions to have their worldview and their way of being taught appreciated. I have a son that studied medicine and a daughter that studied law. And I can tell you every day that they had to struggle in the belly of the beast, because we had the highest of health outcomes, and we were filling the jails. And so you have to really deconstruct and start to remove the shackles that have bound us. I've had to do that too. I had the privilege of listening to Papa Ranga read, and these are my notes, some of my notes. And she talked, this was 2008. I listened to her in Vancouver, and she was talking about at a diabetes conference. Now, if you understand, diabetes is rampant in our community. And I'll speak later on about an ACE study, but she goes on to talk about, we need to know about colonization because it's really impacted us. It's impacted our health. We're coming out of, we have to understand trauma because of it, because our realities were myths. They were not considered our worldview. The dominator stories became the reality. Colonization has transformed nations. Within our own nations, we become insiders and outsiders. And that has resulted in resentment, frustration, and anger. It's impacted us socially, politically, economically. We have challenges around breakdowns within social structures. It's impacted our governance structures. And it's been a barrier for our development. And it can lead to high crime and high risk behavior. So when you start to deconstruct that history, you have to think about trauma, historic trauma that Dr. Yellowhorse Braveheart was talking about. And then, so here, it was like I hit this epiphany. I had this aha moment when I was years ago, I came across the Adverse Childhood Experience study, a major study that was done in San Diego. And it was done on 17,000 middle-class Americans. And it looked at their health outcomes later in life, but it looked at their health based on their childhood. And these were the categories. So you can Google this ACE study and you can find out for yourself. They have a questionnaire and you can do it because it looks at abuse, psychological abuse that children would have experienced from their parents, physical, sexual abuse from anyone, neglect, emotional or physical, household dysfunction, which I'm going to say household woundedness. And in that regard, I encourage you to take a look at the work of Duran and Duran, where they talk about soul wounds. Because again, when I was looking at this research, that resonated for me because people who experience trauma aren't dysfunctional. They are experiencing trauma at a soul level. And so when they talk here about dysfunction, household dysfunction, around alcoholism or drugs, loss of biological parent, depression, mental illness, mothers being treated violently, imprisoned household members. That household pain then was in a middle class American study. So then I started to ask myself, okay, let's imagine if our people did this assessment with our history in this country, what would those outcomes be? So Folletti and others, there's a whole bunch of them, about 8 authors of this research. At the bottom of that pyramid, you see adverse childhood experiences. And at the top of it, you see early death, and you see disease, disability, and social problems. I don't have the time to go into this ACE study, but I put it in here because it's really important that if in Western society, in middle-class America, the physicians are recognizing childhood trauma leads to all of these, then one has to ask yourself, what are the health outcomes and other outcomes for Indigenous people, given the genocidal history that Canada is only starting to educate all Canadians about? So in looking, of course, at this research, often we hear, and I've heard this in meetings, just get over it. That's the past. It's gone now. So get on with your life. And this elder, Iron Child, Murray, I believe his first name is, I pardon me for not putting his name in there, but his quote, "For my family, the effects of residential school will never come to an end. Residential schools and the traumatic experiences of the past are the underlying reasons for all the sickness today. We didn't commit a sin, but it was passed through us, passed on to us by the priests and the Indian agents. I hear residential school survivor stories every day. And if it were not for my spirituality, I would go crazy." And I have to say, when I read that quote, I have to say, if I couldn't contextualize historic trauma and come from a place of understanding and participating in ceremony as well, I think it would be really overwhelming for me too, and I could go crazy, because as a woman who lives in the community and does this work and understands how complex it is and how deep it is and how much pain there is, I'd go crazy too. So I really wanted to put this, because I've been in many meetings where people would say, get over that now. And I ask you to think about, the world wars. We never forget them. We remember them because we don't want that to ever happen again. We remember 9/11 because we don't want that to happen again. We remember the Jewish Holocaust because we never want that happen again. But for some reason, it seems okay to say to Indigenous people, that was in the past. Just get over it now, move ahead. Because there's this sense of dehumanization of Indigenous people, that we're insignificant, we're othered, we're invisible, and yet we have been the kindest people because in treaties, we agreed to share the land. We agreed to share. So this journey for you that I invite you on with me is to learn this and learn it and be minded and with an open heart to come into the work and not say, just get over it. And don't have reconciliation fatigue, because we're in the infancy of reconciliation, 2015, right? So imagine 43 years of my life, I've been trying to teach this, to have all kinds of accusations and people angry, you're biased because you're teaching this, when for 22 years of my life, I had to go to the belly of the beast, to the academy, to do an undergrad degree, to do a master's, a bachelor's, and 12 years in high school. And we're supposed to get over this, where we've never had a chance to share our beautiful way of living that invites all of us in. So that's why this work for me, and being invited to talk with you, is really important. So when we're trauma informed, we need to remember, especially right now with Kamloops, right? That was a big, big event in this country where people were told, you know, that there were 250 potential burial sites of children. So when we're talking about trauma, we need to be aware that people who've experienced trauma are at risk of being re-traumatized every time. And going back then to the ACE study, so watch the triggers, be careful of that. You know, the case of Joyce Echequan, the Native lady in Quebec who was chained to the health gurney because the staff thought that she was drunk. And she basically filmed her own death because her lungs were full of fluid and she died being chained. Brian Sinclair, who lost his legs, he was an epileptic and he had a seizure. He froze. People thought he was drunk and he ended up losing his legs. And then he was sick and he went to the hospital for help. He was dead in emergency for over 30 hours before people realized. And rigor mortis, I think is the wording, when the body starts to harden up, was setting in. So ask yourself what that does when people continuously experience that, because that's being experienced in primary care and mental health services, addiction services, and housing, you know. And so the commitment we need to make is how we are going to offer appropriate services by people who are affected, because we're now with this 215, people are stepping in to learn. And just imagine what the people who've got to relive that, like even within my own family, you know, when you've got to go through this. My husband went to Blue Quills. So when we're trauma informed, we need to acknowledge that that trauma is pervasive, it's there. And we need to create safety. And we have to absolutely focus on trust and good choice and control. We have to have compassion. We have to work together, and we have to take a strength-based approach, because we got to recognize, you know, the challenges. You know, what's the community capacity? What's leadership practices? You know, what kind of staff development are we doing that internally within nations who are coming to terms with this? And externally, like, what is our development? So what are our post-secondary institutions doing to practice implementing these calls to action that Dr. Hewitt spoke of? Like, how are we making space? How are we giving voice to, and how are we finding compassion, leading with compassion around how we do this work? So I just put these two graphics here. These are pictures of students that I worked with. They were young. They were 12 to 17. And I asked them about families and health. So I asked them what was important to them. And I did proper protocol around offering tobacco. And when you do this work, like, it's hard work because these children are experiencing violence as well. So I worked with putty, and I put the putty in the middle of the table. So the putty could be the means to the end of us having a conversation. So the fist and the bong were the sadnesses that children experience around this trauma. Really, when I asked them, what do you need? They really wanted time with their families. They didn't ask for technology. They wanted time, So that's internally one example of what we need to do. In order to go ahead, we have to go back and we need to understand this. And so within the academy, how do we share power? How do we make space for the Indigenous voice? How do we challenge status quo? How do we deal with racism? You know, I have one of my former students telling me a story last week, and she's a Métis woman doing excellent work. So she was going to a life coach, a coach on leadership, and this is an older white man, and I'm saying this with respect. He could not imagine that racism existed, and he pretty much shut her down. So this is something that we need to be open to, take a sidestep and listen and give people an opportunity for them to voice. But as we do that, we have to be mindful that we can't, you know, we might be the trigger. The anger that might come out could be at us if we are white family members, for example, and it's not, the anger might not be you directly, but you represent the source of their pain. So we need to be mindful of this. And so the losses are perpetual, you know, and we have to unlearn this patriarchal oppression, which we're having to come to grips with internally because of, you know, oppressed people turn around and oppress their own people. That's, the research is clear on that. So we have to help our community members deal with these things that I've commented on the side, on the left-hand side. We have to unlearn and relearn and help through compassion and love. Some of the trauma authors that I've met these people. Dr. Bruce Perry, I attended one of his sessions, one of his books. This is one of his latest books that he authored with Oprah Winfrey. And it asks the question, what happened to you? And it's conversations on trauma, resilience, and healing. So instead of asking what happened to you and sort of almost having the shame-based approach, asking the question, you know, we ask what happened to you versus what's wrong with you, because then it focuses on there's something wrong with that person, when in fact, there's some probably trauma that we're dealing with. And Dr. Gaber Mate, like, you can look at his documentaries, you can look at his books. Again, he's an author that I attended a workshop from, and he is such a compassionate leader and educator around trauma. I strongly encourage you to look at these authors. So the land is our mother. Ironically, that picture there is of Cypress Hills in Medicine Hat, and that's from Google. And so if you go there, we have a creation story that places us in that land, and we say our relatives come from that land. So, and the petroglyphs, you know, if the land is our collective mother, how are we learning about the land? And here I want to encourage you to watch the film Reserve 107, because a land acknowledgement is words without action. Ironically, that picture on the left, which if you look at it, it looks almost like a visual of a person, right? And it's so, that's sacred land for us. But when you look at that, there's an oil well there. That road where it looks to be like an earring, that's an oil well. So you have to ask yourself in this work, would we drive through a church? Would we drive through a mosque? But it seems to be okay to go and put these type of things on our land for us, which is very sacred. That's sacred land. So think about the land as our collective mother, because she is. The land speaks to us and about the importance of us looking after her. Watch the movie Reserve 107 and start to deconstruct and think about land back and how that could happen. So when I was working at the University of Alberta full time, we put together a training program for industry, government, the private sector, the academy, where we had Indigenous scholars who team taught with elders, was land-based, and we privileged our own knowledge alongside the Western Academy, because I can tell you that that is a head-to-heart journey when you make space, because I can also tell you of all of the years of teaching, and my doctorate is in leadership. So I've developed programs at the master's level, at the undergrad level, around threading Indigenous knowledge with Western knowledge. And the irony of this is, I can tell you, never in all of the years when I came home from getting my doctorate in 2000, and we started to build our own programs, our own degrees, and then go out and negotiate for transferability, never did I ever hear the elders say, we do not want that Western knowledge. And yet, when you think of what Indigenous people have suffered as a result of our knowledge not being there and being embedded and giving it its rightful place, how our world, how our institutions could be so much better because of what those teachings are, because our worldview is very different than what we're all taught with and indoctrinated with within the Western Academy. So search that out, look for those elders, look for those teachings. I met Dr. Reagan as well, and she wrote a book called Unsettling the Settler Within. That was her dissertation, and she was writing at the time of the Truth and Reconciliation. And she talks about relationships being key, because for us, they are. That's why the Iron Horse, for me, it's a hard thing. It's a hard sell, but we're forced into it because of how our work and our worldview is around relationships. And her quote, I say, all people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians, need to take that genuine leap of imagination to guide our steps today and into the future. In reality, the institutions don't lead social change. It's us, the people, all right? So we have to figure out how we're going to step into this at that heart level. She says we have to face our history honestly and with courage in ways that transforms not just our minds, but our hearts and our spirits. Challenging our assumptions, exploring our myths about our shared history is the first step towards engaging in a deeper transformative dialogue with Indigenous people about what really constitutes a just reconciliation and how we might work towards an ethical peace. So I would ask you to think about your privilege. What privilege do you have? How could you make space? How could we be stronger together? Because I can tell you, in 2022, racism is alive, it's rampant, and it hurts. And my son is a physician. And when, I've got all kind of stories, but I'll just tell you that one. And he's got long hair. And he was a resident in Victoria, this happened. And he was called, he got a page to go check. A woman was going to have a baby and he was looking after her. And a nurse was, I guess they had shift changed or whatever. She literally grabbed my son's braid and asked him where he was going when he was going to check on his patient. This is not long ago. My daughter studied law. She does legal work for a nation. This was recently too. She was shopping in a grocery store, and the security followed her my little grandson had his jacket off because I guess he was hot and she was carrying it. And she was being accused of stealing the jacket that my little grandson was wearing. So if I could ask you, it's going to be that please understand that this trauma rolls out, it's painful. Racism is rampant, it hurts, and we need to step into this work together. So our elders always tell us that we are all related, and our teachings are about us being related. And in those teachings, we have prophecies. And in this work, you know, Stuart Steinhauer, who is a carver from Saddle Lake, and I have his work here because I want to show you the syllabics. The bear for us is the keeper of the land. The paws represent our laws, and that bear steps on the land, protecting the land, and does it with kindness, with honesty, with strength and determination, with sharing. That those laws guide how we are to operate in our day-to-day life. And so the elders say we are related as red, yellow, black, and white family. So one of my mentors, who is younger than me, we were talking, and if you watch the films at the end that Dr. Ewert will mention, she said to me one day, Pat, we can't talk about race. We have to talk about family. So if you're wondering why I talk red, yellow, black, and white family, it's for that reason, because we know that racism is a social construction. So to keep this sense of superiority and segregation. So this carver, who's from Saddle Lake, uses our knowledge system to imprint in those carvings our knowledge and our teachings. So if you were to Google, for example, Stuart Steinhauer, you would see all kinds of carvings, but it's elements of our Indigenous knowledge, that we are collectively on this journey together, and it's lifelong. You know, when we go to school and we get our master's degree or we get our doctor's degree, they'll tell you, oh, you're an expert now. But we aren't experts in our worldview. It's a lifelong journey of being humble about how we serve, how we try to lift everybody up. All right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Makokis, for your enlightening talk and the journey that you shared of your family, your husband, and your grandson, and how trauma has impacted every generation. I'd now like to turn to the questions, and I think we have time for a couple. There were lots of questions, but we'll share them with you later. The very first question that has come up by an audience member is, what recommendations do you have to address intergenerational trauma in the classroom for students who are directly impacted by this trauma as those who are not?
I think that the first thing, and if from a research place, we already know this, you know, when I did my doctorate on why our kids are dropping out of school, for example, children need at least one person in the classroom that they know is going to be safe, who's going to be compassionate, who's going to love and care for them. And as teachers, that's us. You know, when I was a principal, I would go and I would wait at the door and I would hug the kids. And I know that there's all kinds of stuff around, you know, touching children and so forth. But I would stand at the door and I would greet the children. I would greet the young people that came through, and I would go to ceremony with them when I was able to, because they need to know that we care about them, that we are that person that's going to love them. You know, leadership, when I first started studying leadership, you know, you learn about command and control and hierarchical. You learn about all kinds of power structures and different kinds of leadership. And over the years, as I've continued to read and, you know, look at the literature, you would hear about mindfulness and you would hear about intuitive leadership. Back when I started, you wouldn't have heard about that. And I think what that says for me is we're moving in how we lead to this compassion-centered leadership, which then really, if we're practicing compassionate leadership, we then are going to come from that place of our heart to help children. I'm here talking about Indigenous children, but really all children need love. And we are those first, when our students come to us, whether they're children or even adults, because I'm teaching master students, and my master students are decolonizing themselves. They're impacted by what they're learning, by what they're reading, that they didn't know, and they want the same as what you're asking. And what I suggest to you is we need to move from our head to our heart in how we lead. And if we do that, we will do good work, no matter at what level.
Thank you, Dr. Makokis. The next question is for younger students. For younger students, do you have any suggestions for taking back this work to the classroom, and a classroom that's for younger students?
Well, you know, when I showed the putty, I was mindful that I was going to work with a group of students that might be shy. They didn't know me. They didn't have any relationship with me. And so I used art, right? And I just left it open. I asked the two questions: what makes you sad about health in our community? And what would make you happy? And I left the putty in the middle, and I left the students, and then we came back, and the putty became the safe way for us to have conversations about what they created. And they were able to converse because they spoke through the putty. They spoke through the activity. So that's one activity. But I would say find, other activities, because the activity becomes the safe space for them to be able to talk about what they need and how we can help them.
Thank you for that suggestion. And my last question, I think I'll try to squeak it in, is how does a non-Indigenous person become an ally for all Indigenous peoples?
You know, that is a very good question. And I want you to watch the films that we made, and Dr. Ewert has those links, because for the rest of my life, that's the work I'm doing. We're making our third film, and how I see ally work is we need to be what some of the researchers would say co-conspirators, that we have to walk hand in hand. And I don't need people to be performative allies who are going to step into this work if it benefits them. What I need is people who are willing literally to walk hand in hand with me to challenge status quo, to open doors, to make space, to have our voices and our knowledge in places and spaces that we haven't had the privilege of being. And if you watch our second film, you see the vulnerability of the health workers, because my friend Scott McDougall, who managed to get his union, the Health Sciences Association of Alberta, to pay for that film. And you see people's vulnerability as they cry and they acknowledge their racism, their stereotypical views, their the myths, what they didn't know about our people. And so I said to Scott, when we do this interview, we need to be sitting side by side. We need to be talking and walking almost hand in hand, because I need to know that he's going to help me make space. And I guarantee, because he's my friend and I trust him, I know that his heart is in the right place. that I will take him into spaces that he wouldn't be able to get in as well. And when we do that, we will work together to be these co-conspirators to make space and bring all of our families together, the red, the yellow, the black, and the white. And so our third film that's going to be out in June, we're going to launch it, will have these teachings, because we're all treaty people. We are on this land because Indigenous people agreed to share. They agreed to share because we came from our worldview that had a relationship with our mother, the earth, and everything on it. And this other worldview didn't come from that. So when you look at legal documents now, you know, they refer to the treaties as cede and surrender. Number one, how do you give away your mother? Number two, how do you use language like that? Number three, they wouldn't have even been speaking the same language. So these are the things that I'm pleading with you to deconstruct. Start to sit around your kitchen tables with your families and ask the question, what do I know about Indigenous people? And if it's negative, which I suggest it probably is going to be, you know, for example, that we're lazy, drunken Indians that don't work and are freeloaders, ask where that came from and start searching out the truth, because there is all kinds of research out there, all kinds of information, all kinds of videos, because you are master students, and people, especially if you're educators or health officials, health personnel, our people are dying. That's the reality. So understanding trauma and the depth of it and the complexity of it with an open mind and an open heart is what we're called to do in this work together.
Dr. Makokis, I just would like to thank you so much and point out the film links in the chat. Dr. Ewert.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I learned so much. I know that our audience did as well. So we really, from the bottom of our heart, we want to thank you for this incredible presentation. I will note to all of our attendees that if we go back a little bit, there are some educational technology ideas and links for integrating this into the work that you are currently doing, whether it be as educators or health advisors. And this will be available on our website. And I know that we have also had all of the resources and references available as well. And thank you to Vanessa for sharing all the links in the chat. That will also be available on the MET website. But I think Dr. Makokis, you said it perfectly. This is the call to action. Start having those conversations. Start really taking the teachings and learnings from today and speaking about those, and start having those difficult conversations with your neighbors, with your colleagues, with your class, if you are teachers. And this is part of that call to action. So it could be on a grander gesture where you create a lesson plan that integrates the teachings and learnings from today. All of this is available on the MET website. I know that we've spoken to this point on many other presentations, but I don't want to take people's time today. This is available if you're interested, and you can always contact us as well. And we do have a Twitter hashtag that you can engage in this call to action and share with us all the great work that you are doing. We will place that in the chat area as well. And I'll just pass it over quickly to Dr. Samia Khan, who will speak to our next series that we'll be presenting next month.
So next month, we would like to introduce Dr. Camille Rutherford, who is joining us as a professor of education and vice provost strategic partnerships and international at Brock University. Her work with teachers, adult educators, leaders, and tech companies explores the use of tech to transform leadership and enhance teaching and learning. She will be speaking about techno-racism, as well as EDI, DAA, Future Ready Education. We hope you can join us on Wednesday, May 25th at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for this presentation. And we'll share the link in the chat for you to register for the talk as well. And with that, I would like to invite you to consider the call to action again and to thank Dr. Patricia Makokis for her incredibly valuable talk. I think we need more talks from her and from people like her. So I'm looking forward to future discussions on this topic. And in fact, at my dinner table tonight.
Awesome.
Thank you, Dr. Makokis. That was amazing.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you, attendees, for coming. We appreciate it.